The image of that day is permanently burned into my mind. It was September 3rd, 2002. Our country was still grieving from the attacks the year prior, and patriotism was at a 2-decade high. I'd just met my wife at a friend's birthday party a month earlier. Everything was looking rosy for me. Work was my only weak point, and when I say weak, I simply mean I was stuck in a rut. Not good, nor bad. A day or two before Halloween, I saw my chance to further myself in the company. There was an amazing opportunity opening up in Mexico City, but if I wanted to take advantage, I had to fly out as soon as possible. After discussing this with my boss, he gave me the okay to pursue it. I immediately purchased a plane ticket for midnight and landed just as the sun rose the next morning. And according to my contacts, the man I was planning to meet wouldn't be available until after 8 a.m. I took advantage of the gap in time by taking a nap. When I woke up, I took a quick shower and climbed into my best suit. I was about to make the most important contact in my life, and looking my best would be of the utmost necessity. As the time approached, I called down to the front desk to get me a taxi. I reached the lobby where a young man showed me to my ride. I was feeling good that morning, and in retrospect, I made a big mistake. Foolishly, I tipped the clerk a $50 bill. His eyes almost blew out of his head. In light of what happened, I'm almost positive he was the person who sold me out. From the hotel, the taxi driver took me to my meeting. We made small talk along the way. He agreed to wait for me. I estimated the meeting wouldn't be more than an hour, and he seemed happy for this. As for the meeting itself, it probably could have gone better, but my goal was ultimately achieved. I returned to the taxi, and we began the return trip to the hotel. My mood was somewhat darker, and I avoided any conversation. I was in the process of texting my boss when the car stopped abruptly. This caused me to be slammed into the back of the seat. Naturally, I was livid. The curses came fast and loose from my mouth. Just as I regained the seat positioning, I noticed another taxi was parked in front of us. The driver of my car was silent. This didn't stop me from asking what was going on. I now realized that he was well aware of what was happening and may have played his own part in it. If I hadn't been yelling like a madman, I may have noticed the guy standing outside my window a little sooner. I just happened to catch a flash in my peripheral vision. When I looked over, I was met with a gun pointed right at me. I wasn't sure what was going on, but I raised my hands to indicate I was no threat. The guy holding the gun yanked my door open and demanded I give him my money. I quickly complied. While this was happening, a voice in the back of my head was praying he wouldn't notice my watch. It was very special to me. It belonged to my father. He was gifted it by my mother on their 25th anniversary. I received it in his will when he passed in '97. Under normal circumstances, I wouldn't wear something so valuable, especially in Mexico, but it had been good luck in the past and I needed it on this trip. All this caused me to hesitate when the gunman started yelling "watch" in broken English. I tried to pretend I didn't understand. He grabbed at my wrist with his empty hand instead. I stupidly yanked my arm away and he drove the pistol into my guts. Everything went into slow motion. I watched in horror as the hammer on the revolver began cocking back. He clearly wasn't messing around. I managed to get the watch off before the gun went off. He let off the trigger, just in time as far as I could tell. He ran back to the other taxi and they tore off down a side street. I was just beginning to see that I had been taken into the middle of nowhere. Not a soul was around and the buildings were barely standing upright. Had I been 10 years younger, I probably would have fought back. The environment in the taxi afterwards was chilling. I could see the driver's eyes darting back and forth in the rearview mirror. He didn't dare speak. He had to know I suspected him. Why hadn't he been robbed also? I now had an important decision to make. Was I going to the police or just returning to the hotel and then going to the airport? I was stuck between two decisions. It's no secret the Mexican police are corrupt. For all I know, even they could be complicit in the robbery. The angry side of me said to confront the hotel clerk. I took a few moments to consider my options and chose to cut my losses and just get out of Mexico. I told the driver to return to the hotel if he wanted to be paid. This wasn't my first rodeo after all. I never carried much cash on my person. What I left behind would be all but impossible to find if a hotel employee went snooping. Upon our return, I ran up to my room and retrieved the taxi money. I paid him without a word, and he took off just as silently. It was now time for the clerk to feel my wrath, and he greeted me with a fake smile and asked how things were going. In a calm but aggressive voice, I mentioned the robbery. I had no time for his false sympathy and informed him how his accomplices had gotten away with a mere $30 in cash. There was no way I was going to give him the satisfaction of knowing how badly the loss of my father's watch hurt me. He tried to deny it all, of course, but I wasn't hearing it. Not once did he offer to call the police. I told him that I knew what he'd done, and that I was going to make sure everyone I talked to was aware of what was happening in this hotel. I closed by calling him a low-life scumbag and made my way from my room. It wasn't much, but it was going to have to do. I went back to my room and gathered my things to leave. I paid for the hotel beforehand, and my plane ticket was a round trip. I had no further need of that place and its staff. There were several taxis waiting outside the hotel. I grabbed one and he drove me to the airport, and I had no further problems from then on. I had waited to notify my boss of the robbery until I returned to work. He was horrified, as you'd expect. I also made sure that he knew I was never returning to Mexico again. He could fire me if he wanted, but there was no amount of money that could draw me back there. To his credit, he was cool and understood my reservations. My next call was to the man I'd gone there to meet. I wasn't contacting him for any updates as much as letting him know that I'd be passing off any future dealings to another team member. When he inquired why, I told him about the robbery and stressed that I held him in no way responsible for it. He didn't say much other than he understood, and we ended the call. I must admit I was somewhat shocked when I heard that he had agreed to the deal. Even better, he would be coming to the US in the future as to prevent any further threats to our employees. I can't say for sure, but I kinda think he may have felt guilty, although I made it clear I didn't blame him. We've never talked about it, and that's fine with me. I'd rather forget about it myself. This will be my last time discussing the matter. There was one last call I had to make, and it was the hardest. The sadness in her voice upon hearing of the watch was crystal clear. Mom said she didn't blame me, but I could tell it hurt her soul to hear that. It was the first time I can remember crying since second grade. I've since purchased another date made the same year and had it inscribed with the same words as Dad's. I wear it every year at Christmas, and that's all. Mom loves seeing it, but I'm well aware it will never be a true replacement for the original. Back when I was 17, my first real girlfriend texted me one night to be like, "Parents are on a date night. Come over and we'll have the place to ourselves." Yep, the text that every young man waits for, the one that makes everything around you glow in gold while you hear the voice of God saying, "My son, you have been chosen. Now go forth and multiply." I've been planning on a night of Modern Warfare 3 with the boys, but within minutes, I was in the shower scrubbing the enamel off my teeth in order to become a little mint, drowning myself in cologne and raiding my brother's rubber stash for an entire platoon's worth. I remember texting her like, "Want me to bring anything over? I got a few Red Barons." And she just replied, "Nah, just bring yourself." What a feeling, dude. Girlfriend is home alone and all she wants delivered is me. So I rushed to finish off getting dressed. Spent like 5 straight minutes in the mirror making sure I looked fresh and clean. So fresh and so clean. And then I was ready to go. The walk over to my girlfriend's place took like 20 minutes, so from the time of getting the text to me actually arriving, couldn't have been any more than an hour. She had one of those long driveways too, not like some southern manor house or anything like that, but enough so you got a long look at the house as you were walking up to it. Then right as I'm about halfway up the driveway, I see someone walking through one of the upstairs bedrooms who was definitely not my girlfriend. I stop dead in my tracks, look up at this guy, and I've got this weird mix of anger and confusion and just utterly feeling a little bit heartbroken. I whip out my phone, dial my girlfriend's number, only to find her phone is switched off. My head is just swimming with negative thoughts. I think I was about to have a panic attack, like I just couldn't believe she'd do that to me. I was checking if I had the right house, double-checking the upstairs bedroom, like 100% certain that I'd just seen someone, but also telling myself, no way, I must be hallucinating or something. But nope. That same dude in the green hoodie walks through her parents' bedroom again, like all the way in and then all the way out. But on the way out, he sees me and he stops and stares at me. He's looking at me like, who are you, my guy? Where I'm looking at him like, me? Who are you? But as I'm looking, I notice there's something weird about his face. It's all distorted. And then it hits me that his face is all distorted because he's wearing like literal pantyhose over his head, like a meme of a bank robber or something. Then right as I'm thinking like, what kind of weird stuff is this? I'm like, oh no, he's not a meme. He's literally robbing the place. I just panicked and ran back down the driveway before dialing 911. But then, as I'm giving the operator all the details, I realized that my arrival might have prompted something bad to happen to my girlfriend. I ended up running back up the driveway, kicking on the door and shouting up at the window, "Cops are on their way, you better get out of there." I added a few expletives, but I won't say them here. I didn't hear anyone shouting back. In fact, I couldn't hear anything going on inside at all. But that didn't mean there wasn't anything going on. The intruders, home invaders, whatever you want to call them, they could have been doing anything to my girlfriend in there. And that's if they hadn't done something irreversible already. Waiting those few minutes for the cops to arrive was agony, but the dispatcher promised me that they'd roll up with their lights and sirens blaring to try and scare the intruders off. We later found out that worked like a charm, but no one realized that until we were inside and my girlfriend was safe. She was scared to death, but she was okay, and it turned out that my timing had been absolutely impeccable. The two guys that broke in through the rear door of the house had only just tied her up in her bedroom and were right in the middle of ransacking the house when I showed up. And yes, they were actually wearing pantyhose. Seems kind of ridiculous, but the cops told me it's the smart choice for home invaders, I guess. You get pulled over with a ski mask in your passenger seat in Florida, questions are going to be asked. But a pair of pantyhose, you could just shrug it off and say, oh, that's just Mima's laundry day, or something, and there's no probable cause. Needless to say, when the cops left, we were way too shaken up for any alone time, and my girlfriend was in no mood to hang out at a place that had just gotten broken into, so we ended up going back to my parents' place to hang out. Nothing in the way of privacy, so I didn't get the explosive evening I'd been hoping for, but still, it was just cool to have been the one to have saved her, as she put it. I didn't save anyone. Those dudes only bailed when the cops showed up, but still, you can bet I took all the credit she wanted to give me. We ended up dating until maybe our sophomore year of college. After that, neither of us could handle the distance, but we still keep in touch, and I'm pretty sure our little post-relationship friend status is rooted solely in that mild shared trauma of having confronted a pair of home invaders together. I used to use Craigslist a whole bunch, and I only ever had one weird or creepy thing happen to me. To this day, I still don't know if it was real or just some elaborate prank, but it definitely left me with a feeling of unease for a few weeks after. So I grew up here in Brighton Beach, Brooklyn, and my parents were fresh off the boat from Kazakhstan. I'll give you a minute to make the Borat joke I know you're dying to make, but once it's out of your system, understand that as Kazakhs growing up in Brighton Beach, I grew up hearing a wide variety of Slavic and Central Asian languages. I knew Kazakh from mom and dad. I learned a lot of Russian due to our neighbors. Heck, we even had a Uzbek landlord who lived on the ground floor, and my dad worked with a guy from Turkmenistan who used to sing me old Turkmen nursery rhymes. Needless to say, when it came to being a broke college student at NYU, and I heard people would pay for translation services on Craigslist, I was desperate enough to post an ad. I was surprised how many people needed translation work done, but it was mostly inquiries stemmed from the Russian to English ad I posted in Russian, and only a handful of emails or calls came from people wanting the reverse. Then, one day I get an email from a random email address asking if I could translate some Russian into English. I replied saying sure, and they ended up emailing me 2 paragraphs of what looked like handwritten letters. I say they were letters, but they didn't have any names or addresses attached to them. Maybe there was an address and the guy just didn't show me the envelope or whatever, but either way, I noticed something was wrong almost right away. First of all, the paper was filthy. I could barely make out the lettering, but the sender assured me that he'd pay for whatever I could translate. Secondly, although the letters or notes were written in Cyrillic characters, it most definitely wasn't Russian. I told the person it'd take me a few days to get the translation done, making up some lie about being busy with college, but really, I was asking around my neighbors to see if any of them recognized the language. Eventually, a neighbor of mine recognized that the language was Serbian. They didn't speak any Serbian, but they knew enough to recognize it, and more importantly, they knew someone could translate it. I printed out 2 black and white copies of the photos. The lettering was more pronounced that way, then headed over to this old Serbian guy's apartment on Neptune Avenue. The guy was super friendly at first, inviting me in and offering me tea. I accepted, offering him a little box of bundavara, which are Serbian pastries, in return, mainly as a thank you for doing the translation for me. We sit down, he puts on his glasses, I hand him the printouts, and he begins to study them. He stops at one point to point out the obvious, very difficult to read, but as he continues, his happy little expression fades and he begins to look very, very serious. I'm just sitting there, notebook and pen in hand, ready to jot down what the notes say, but the Serbian guy isn't saying anything. I have to actually press him for even just an idea of what the notes said, and at that point, he just looks up at me and says, "I don't know. I think it's something about the war." I assumed the war he was referring to were the series of conflicts in the former Yugoslavia. These were particularly cruel conflicts that often had an ethnic or religious slant to them, so as soon as he said that, I got a particularly bad feeling in my gut. When the guy had finally stopped reading, he looked at me from over his glasses and asked, "Where did you get this?" I was honest and I told him I'd been sent it as part of a small translation business I ran through Craigslist. But who sent this? I had to tell him I didn't know. The email address was just a Hotmail account, some non-English word, and some numbers for a username, and it wasn't like I pressed my clients for any personal information. All I was interested in was their PayPal ID. The guy began shaking his head. "I don't like this," he said. "This is very bad. Very bad people sent you this, do you understand?" At that point, I was so desperate to know what the note said that I was just about ready to strangle him, and in the politest way possible, I asked him to cut the nonsense and tell me what he'd read. I wrote all this down, and it's fragmented and the translation might not be the best, but here it goes. In a large house found near Bostahovin, all the phone lines have been cut. No other means of communication. Don't believe the commander if he says we're doing fine. We finished off everyone in Fajr. But everything since then, the situation has been worse and worse. It started after we marched into the hills near Brocolli. During the march, totally disappeared. We sent out a small patrol, but they too stopped answering their radios and we haven't heard from them since. Dragan thinks, afraid, but no one shows it. Found salvation when we came across the house. There were Turks inside and we took them outside. We had to cut off the girl's head to shut her up. The other bodies were still moving when we carried them away and tossed them. So many bullets, more didn't help. We buried them deep, but in the morning the pit had been dug up. They were gone. The Turk fighters here are different. Kolha, they only come at night. It's like they can see in the dark. You must ask command to send everyone they can, Kolha, or I'm afraid we won't live to see the dawn. I remember the chill that ran through the air when the guy stopped talking, and I suddenly understood why he was so agitated after reading through the notes. I thought he might be able to provide some insight into what he thought was happening to the author, but apart from a brief primer of the Yugoslav civil wars, he couldn't say much. What he did say was that the Turks the author was referring to were most likely probably Bosnian Muslims, as the Serb paramilitaries used Turk as a pejorative for them. But without any information on dates and units, it was almost impossible to discern who wrote the note, and when it was written. However, it's quite clear that it was written to a person named Kolya or Kolha. Maybe a relative of the author, or this Kolya person was looking for them years after the war. Maybe they weren't holding out hope of finding a live person either, and maybe one of them had crossed the Atlantic at some point since the early 90s, hence why it was me that got an email stemming from my Craigslist ad. These were all things that were running through my head at the time, and for the most part, the Serbian guy agreed, but he did have something to add before I left. "Many bad things happened during the war," he said. "And this too is very bad, but it's also, how you say, proklet." He used a Serbian word, but it was one with its roots in the Russian word of the same meaning, so it didn't need any translating. Cursed. I'm not gonna lie, I was definitely freaked out by whatever vague story the notes told, but I just thought it was some small piece, a clue even in some wider, more tragic tale. I just went home, sent the original emailer their translation, got paid, and went about my business. It wasn't until much later on that I started to really mull over what the note said, and there was this one week where I basically obsessed over it, trying to interpret meaning, filling in the gaps, and even Googling a couple of the places' names. But I think it's that line that reads, "Bodies were still moving," that sticks with me the most. They talked about decapitating someone, and the body was still moving? I'm not saying anything supernatural was happening. I imagine a headless person is a lot like a headless chicken. But then I start to consider the part where it said, "It's like they can see in the dark," and my imagination really starts to run away with me. For quite a while, I'd have done almost anything to know what happened to the person who wrote those notes, but I think I'd be better off not knowing. Back when I was just an 11-year-old kid, my entire life was almost completely ruined on a Friday night in June. My mom and dad went out to some work-related event after dinner and told me they'd be back at around midnight. They gave me $20 to order takeout from somewhere, told me to not stay up too late, then just left me to it. I had a great time, at first anyway, just stuffing my face and watching cartoons until I passed out on the couch surrounded by candy wrappers. I'm not sure how long later, but I woke up and immediately I can tell something is different. I know it might sound weird when I say I could feel like a breeze on my face from the back door being open, but when you live somewhere for that long, I feel like you can pick up little subtle environmental changes. The point is, I got up to check the back door and what do you know? It's wide open. I didn't remember opening it before I nodded off, but since I was so sleepy, I didn't put too much thought into it, and I just closed the door, turned off the TV and downstairs lights, then started walking up the stairs to my bedroom. And that's when I hear it, the soft, barely audible sound of crying. It wasn't like a full-on bawling sound, more like softly sobbing, but it definitely sounded like a full-grown man doing the crying, and it was definitely coming from inside our house. I am like pant-wettingly scared, and when I get to the top of the stairs, I can see that someone, definitely not me, has pulled down the ladder to our attic. And whoever it was upstairs in the dark, quietly crying to themselves. I'm not sure I can really put that kind of fear I felt into words, and just as I begin to think to myself, just get out of there, just run to the neighbor's place, I hear the crying stop, followed by not footsteps, but movement up in the attic. That's what freezes me in place, like a deer in headlights, and all I could do was keep my eyes glued to the opening of the ceiling. I remember seeing something. It was like a monster with a red face that drooled when it saw me. But that's only because I lost a little piece of my sanity that night, a piece that I don't ever really think I got back. It obviously wasn't a monster. It was just a person, a very sick one at that. They were in the middle of a compound nervous breakdown, complete paranoid schizophrenic. They thought they were trapped in the wrong body, and so they tried to peel their face off by cutting it to find their real face. At least that's what I was told later. After they realized that they were trapped in their own body, this woman ran for her sister's place, where she was being cared for, and somehow randomly picked our yard to climb into. Then, looking for a place to hide, she went up into our attic, appearing in the hatch to scare the sanity out of me. So, you can see why that might just cause a kid to, well, lose his mind for a while and rationalize it by telling themselves, that wasn't a person back there. People were good. People were normal. What I saw was a monster, or a demon. Anything but a person. After I ran to my neighbors, after the police went through their investigation and my parents came home and everything was said and done, I had to be homeschooled for a while, and I think I had my own little psychotic break. Or rather, I know I did. It made life almost unbearable for my parents, and they were infinitely patient with me, something I'll never stop paying them back for. I suppose some of you might not care who or what I am now, but for those of you that do, be glad to know that I'm doing okay. My wife doesn't know about what happened to me when I was a kid. I never had the heart to tell her. I know all it'll do is upset her and make her worry, and I've had quite enough of that for one lifetime. I think she suspects something, though. What with the way I'm basically obsessed with home security, and maybe that's just a mark of what a good woman she is. She doesn't probe me. She just patiently waits for me to talk about whatever it is when I'm good and ready.